The Navy called the patrol boat, River, the decisive instrument of the Brown Water War. That was the institutional position, stated plainly in the mobile riverine force's own operational directives and echoed in the MACV briefings that described the PBR program to commanders who needed a solution to the Viet Cong's use of the Mekong Delta's 3,500 miles of waterways as a resupply and infiltration network that conventional naval forces could not penetrate. The PBR could go where destroyers and landing ships could not. It could operate in water 18 inches deep. It could reach 28 knots on rivers where the enemy moved supplies at night and vanished before dawn. It was, the program's architects told the men assigned to it, the weapon that would sever the Viet Cong's logistical lifeline through the Delta and the Rung Sat Special Zone, the swampy mangrove estuary southeast of Saigon that American planners called the Forest of Assassins. What the operational directives did not include was what happened to the men inside the weapon when the weapon went where it was told to go. Between 1966 and 1971, Navy PBRs conducted more than 250,000 patrol hours on the rivers and canals of South Vietnam. In that time, River Patrol Force, Task Force 116, Operation Game Warden, lost 247 PBRs to enemy action and operational causes. Of the approximately 500 boats that served, nearly half were destroyed or rendered unserviceable before the program wound down. The men aboard them were operating from fiberglass hulls that measured 31 feet long and weighed fully loaded approximately 8 tons. A platform so small that a single B-40 rocket-propelled grenade penetrating the hull at close range was not a damage control problem. It was a crew survival problem, measured in the seconds between impact and the decision about whether the river or the burning boat was the better option. Those seconds defined the texture of PBR service in a way that the operational directives language about decisive instruments and logistical interdiction could not approach. Start with the machine, because the PBR's specific physical character defined everything about what it meant to be inside one when the riverbanks 20 feet away opened up. The Mark II PBR, which replaced the original fiberglass-hulled Mark I in 1967 and became the standard patrol boat for the remainder of the River War, measured 31 feet from bow to stern, with a beam of 11 feet 7 inches. She was built by Uniflight of Bellingham, Washington, from fiberglass-reinforced plastic, a construction material chosen for its resistance to the freshwater marine growth that ate wooden holes in the Delta's rivers and for the shallow draft. The mission required, not for any protective quality it offered against the weapons the Viet Cong were waiting with on the riverbanks. The hull's water jet propulsion system, twin Jacuzzi Brothers 14YJ pump jets drawing from water intakes beneath the hull and ejecting through steerable nozzles at the stern, was the engineering decision that made 28 knots in 18 inches of water possible and that made PBR operations in the narrow canals of the Delta feasible in a way that propeller-driven craft could not replicate. The water jets could be reversed almost instantaneously, bringing a boat at full speed to a stop in approximately 1.5 boat lengths, a capability that the river's tactical geometry made essential and that crews used with the specific urgency of people for whom stopping quickly was the difference between getting through an ambush and not. Her armament was the other thing, the fiberglass hull defined by contrast. A Mark II PBR carried two twin .50 caliber M2 machine gun mounts forward, 900 rounds per minute each, 1,800 combined, an M67.62 millimeter machine gun amidships, and a single .50 caliber or M60 aft. Some boats carried an M79 grenade launcher or an 81 millimeter mortar in the well deck for fire support missions. The total combined firepower of a single PBR, firing everything simultaneously, was approximately 4,000 rounds per minute of small arms and machine gun fire, a volume of fire that the training materials described as suppressive and that the men who used it on ambushed rivers in the Delta described as the sound of trying to stay alive long enough to get out of the kill zone. The crew was 4 men on a 31-foot boat with 4,000 rounds per minute of firepower, operating in a tactical environment where the enemy had chosen the engagement geometry, the timing, and the range. The range was almost always between 15 and 50 meters, At 15 meters, the bank of a delta river was close enough to hit with a thrown rock. The B-40 rocket-propelled grenade that the Viet Cong used against PBRs had an effective range of 300 meters against stationary targets and was lethal against a 31-foot fiberglass boat at any range the river's geography permitted. The tactical situation that produced most PBR combat losses was one where the enemy had positioned themselves on both banks and waited, and where the boat crew's first indication that they had entered a kill zone was the sound of the initial firing, which on a river 20 feet wide was simultaneous with the rounds hitting the boat. The crew of 4 consisted of the boat captain, a petty officer first or second class, the senior enlisted man responsible for navigation, tactics, and the lives of the 3 men aboard, the engineman who managed the twin General Motors 6V53 diesel engines producing 220 horsepower each, and the water jet systems that the mission depended on, and 2 gunners who manned the forward twin .5s and the aft position. On a 4-man boat in an ambush, everyone who was not driving was shooting, and the boat captain was usually doing both simultaneously, which was what the tactical geometry of a river ambush required, and what no training evolution at Coronado or Mare Island fully replicated. The numbers that define what PBR service in the Delta actually demanded deserve their specific concentrated accounting here, because they establish the gap between the game warden operational concept and the operational reality with a precision that the word dangerous cannot convey. In the Rung Sat Special Zone, the 400-square-mile mangrove swamp through which the Long Tao shipping channel ran, the main deep-water access route for ocean-going vessels reaching Saigon, PBRs operating in 1966 and 1967 were patrolling waterways in which the water itself was tactically hostile. The Rung Sat's tidal rivers rose and fell as much as 10 feet between low and high tide. A canal navigable at high tide was a mudflat at low tide, and a boat caught in a canal at the wrong point in the tidal cycle was a stationary target at the bottom of a 10-foot mudbank, with no room to turn and no speed to run with. The tidal tables were part of every patrol brief. Getting them wrong was a category of error that the Rung Sat did not permit crews to make twice. The ambient temperature in the Delta during the dry season ran between 90 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels between 80 and 95%. A PBR moving at patrol speed, typically 15 to 18 knots, generated enough apparent wind to make the heat manageable for the crew at their stations. A PBR stopped or moving slowly in a narrow canal, conducting a junk inspection or working through shallow water, was a stationary aluminum and fiberglass heat absorber in tropical sun, and the 4 men aboard were in direct sunlight with no overhead cover, except what individual crew members improvised. The Mark II's design did not include crew shade. The design included weapons mounts and fuel tankage and the engineering spaces for the twin diesels. Crew comfort was allocated what remained after the mission requirements were met, which was approximately nothing. The engine spaces themselves, twin GM6 V53 diesels, in an enclosure that measured roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, operated in the same heat environment as the rest of the boat, but with the addition of engine waste heat that pushed the compartment temperature above 130 degrees Fahrenheit at full power in tropical conditions. The engine man who had to access the engine space during patrol, to adjust fuel delivery, address an overheating alarm, clear a water jet intake clogged with the river vegetation that the Delta's waterways carried in quantities that fouled the pump jets, with a frequency the maintenance manuals had not adequately projected, was working in that space in conditions that the Navy's own occupational heat stress guidelines classified as dangerous for sustained exposure. The sustained exposure was what the mission required. A standard PBR patrol on the upper Mekong, or the Cochin River, during the peak of game warden operations in 1968 and 1969, launched from a river patrol base, or from the deck of an LSET, a landing ship tank converted to a mobile river base and designated an APB, housing the boats, their crews, and the support personnel responsible for maintenance and resupply. The patrol launched before dawn because dawn was when the Viet Cong sampan traffic that PBRs were supposed to intercept was most active, and because darkness was the only concealment a 31-foot fiberglass boat with no radar signature to speak of possessed on a river where the enemy had observation posts in every tree line. The patrol covered a defined sector of river, conducting junk inspections, stopping and boarding Vietnamese watercraft to check for contraband weapons, ammunition, and personnel, and responding to contact reports from other patrol elements or from the SEAL teams that game wardens supported in the Delta. The junk inspection was the tactical situation that the training materials described as routine, and that the crews operating in heavily infiltrated areas described differently. A Vietnamese junk on the Mekong in 1968 could be a family transporting rice and fish, which was what most of them were. It could be a Viet Cong logistics vessel transporting weapons and ammunition under the rice and fish, which was what a meaningful percentage of them were, concentrated in ways that the intelligence could not predict at the individual vessel level. The PBR crew conducting the inspection did not know, until they were alongside and one man was aboard the junk while 3 remained on the PBR, which category this vessel fell into. The procedure for the inspection was documented. The procedure for what happened when a junk turned out to be the second category was what the crew managed in real time, in the 6 to 8 seconds between the moment the concealed weapons became visible and the moment the situation resolved one way or another. The psychological weight of the junk inspection, performed dozens of times per patrol in sectors where the proportion of the second category was high enough that experienced crews developed a form of threat assessment that they could not articulate formally, but that expressed itself as a physical response to specific combinations of vessel behavior, crew demeanor, and cargo presentation, was not addressed in any formal doctrine the River Patrol Force operated under. The doctrine addressed inspection procedures. The men developed the rest. By 1968, the operational environment for PBRs had been substantially shaped by the Tet Offensive and its aftermath in ways that the game warden planners had not fully projected when the program was designed in 1965. The Tet attacks on Delta cities and provincial capitals in January and February 1968 demonstrated that the Viet Cong's logistical network through the Delta's waterways had not been severed by 2 years of PBR operations, that weapons and personnel had moved through the patrol zones in quantities sufficient to support coordinated attacks on 36 provincial capitals simultaneously. The operational response was an escalation of river interdiction operations that increased patrol frequency, extended patrol sectors, and pushed PBRs into waterways that the tactical calculus of the previous 2 years had classified as too restricted for safe operations. Too restricted for safe operations was not a classification that the post-Tet operational tempo accommodated. The canals of the Delta's interior, the secondary and tertiary waterways that connected the Viet Cong's base areas to the main river arteries, were not designed by any standard of river patrol safety. They were as narrow as 20 feet in places, lined with nipa palm and mangrove vegetation that extended to the water's edge and provided concealment for ambush positions that a boat crew could not detect until the range was 0. A PBR operating in a canal 20 feet wide had no room to maneuver. It could go forward or backward. It could not turn. The water jet's instantaneous reversing capability was useful. It was not useful enough to change the fundamental geometry of a canal ambush, which was a situation where the enemy had chosen to engage at a range that made the PBR's speed irrelevant, and where the crew's survival depended on suppressive fire volume and the specific competence that experienced crews had built, and that replacements were still developing. The replacement problem on PBRs was a version of the same institutional problem that shaped every American combat unit in Vietnam, expressed in the specific terms of a 4-man boat crew where 1 experienced man and 3 replacements was not a marginal capability reduction. It was a crew that had lost the accumulated situational knowledge that the experienced man had built, and that no training pipeline could provide. The 12-month individual rotation that governed Navy PBR service meant that a boat crew's composition changed continuously, with experienced petty officers rotating out, just as the replacements they had trained reached operational competence. A boat captain completing his tour left behind a crew that had learned from him what the training at Coronado had not covered: the specific sound the water jets made when the intake was beginning to clog, the particular way the current in this stretch of river set the boat toward the eastern bank. When the tide was ebbing, the tree line on the north side of the Ko Chien at kilometer 47, that had produced 3 ambushes in 8 months, and that an experienced crew approached at full speed with the forward guns already depressed to the waterline. When the boat captain left, that knowledge left with him. The replacement arrived with the training and began accumulating the rest. The price of that accumulation was paid in the casualty distribution that game wardens' medical officers documented. Losses concentrated in crews with less than 90 days in country, in waterways that the operational tempo was pushing boats into for the first time, in the specific combination of inexperienced crew and unfamiliar water that the rotation system reliably produced. The specific incident that reaches into the center of what PBR service in the Delta actually demanded is the engagement on the night of January 10th and 11th, 1969, near the village of Juk Pho on the Mekong's Ko Chien tributary, when River Section 533's patrol elements encountered a Viet Cong crossing operation that the intelligence had not predicted, and that the patrol's doctrine had no specific procedure to address. 2 PBRs, PBR 724 and PBR 731, were on routine night patrol when their forward lookout detected movement on the water approximately 200 meters ahead. Night operations on the Ko Chien in January 1969 were conducted without running lights, with the crew using starlight and the ambient light of the Delta sky to navigate, and with the noise discipline that river patrol night doctrine required, engines at reduced throttle, no radio traffic except contact reports, the specific silence that 4 men on a river maintain when they are trying to hear what the river is telling them before the river tells them something they cannot respond to in time. What the forward lookout detected was a crossing operation, approximately 30 Viet Cong moving personnel and weapons across the Ko Chien and sampans, using the darkness and the patrol pattern that the enemy's observation of American PBR operations had allowed them to map with sufficient accuracy to identify the gaps. The 2-boat patrol had found one of those movements at a moment when the range was still workable, close enough to engage, far enough that the boats were not already inside the kill zone. The engagement that followed lasted 11 minutes. Both PBRs went to full throttle and engaged the crossing with the forward twin .5s and the M60 amidships, closing the range to 30 meters in the first pass and taking fire from both banks as Viet Cong security elements responded. PBR 731 took a B-40 hit on the port bow that penetrated the fiberglass hull above the waterline and ignited the forward ammunition stowage. Not catastrophically, because the round's warhead functioned partially and the fiberglass did not burn as rapidly as the crew's first assessment suggested, but enough that the forward gunner, Engineman Second Class David Odom of Augusta, Georgia, was wounded by the initial penetration and was managing his gun mount with his left hand while his right arm, which the fragment had torn through at the elbow, was no longer fully functional. Odom continued firing. The boat captain of PBR 731, Petty Officer First Class, James Thornton of Mobile, Alabama, made the decision in the 4th minute of the engagement to take the boat through the crossing zone at full throttle rather than withdrawing, a decision that the tactical geometry supported because the far bank's security element was lighter than the near banks, and because the boat's speed through the crossing zone would deny the B-40 gunners on the near bank the tracking time they needed for a second shot. Thornton drove through. PBR 724 followed. The crossing zone was 30 meters of open river between the 2 bank positions, covered in approximately 4 seconds at 28 knots, during which both boats were firing everything they had, and the river was returning everything the Viet Cong security elements possessed. Both boats came through. PBR 731 had the bow damage, Odom's wound, and 2 additional fragment wounds to the engine man, who had been in the engine space during the engagement and had come up through the hatch to man the aft gun when the forward position went quiet for the 11 seconds between Odom's wounding and the moment Odom resumed firing. They got back to the RPB at 0340. Odom was treated by the ship's medical officer and evacuated by helicopter to the Naval Hospital at Binh Thuy at 0415. He was back on PBR patrol with River Section 5, 3341 days later. The action at Juk Pho was documented in the game warden operational records as a successful interdiction of a Viet Cong crossing, accurate as far as it went. The crossing was disrupted. Some number of the personnel and weapons moving across the Ko Chien that night did not reach the far bank. What the operational record captured in the language of interdiction, success did not capture, was the 11 minutes that produced it, or what those 11 minutes felt like from the aft gun position of PBR 731, or what it cost a 23-year-old engine man from Augusta to keep a .50 caliber machine gun firing with one functional arm in the 4th minute of a river ambush. Those details lived in the men. They did not always survive the men. The psychological environment of PBR service produced a specific form of combat stress that the Navy's medical establishment of the period was only beginning to develop the clinical vocabulary to describe. The ambient threat of the Delta's waterways, where every tree line was a potential ambush position, where every junk was potentially the second category, where the canal that had been safe on the outbound patrol was not necessarily safe on the return, was not an episodic stress. It was a sustained background condition of maximum vigilance that the patrol duration imposed continuously, and that the short distance between the patrol and the base, a river patrol base or an APB that was itself subject to mortar and rocket attack and occasional direct ground assault, did not interrupt with any significant period of genuine decompression. A PBR crew returning from patrol at 0400, unloading the weapons, refueling the boat, completing the patrol debrief, and lying down in the berthing space of an APB that was anchored in the same river the patrol had just come from was not a crew that had left the tactical environment. They had moved from the active part of it to the stationary part of it, which the Viet Cong addressed with mortars and rockets on a schedule that the base security officers tracked, and that the crews slept through with the specific adaptability of people who had concluded that sleep was necessary regardless of what the mortars were doing. Drug use in the River Patrol Force in the late 1960s and early 1970s was documented in the medical records of river sections operating in the Delta, with a candor that the institutional culture of the period made unusual. Marijuana was available in quantities throughout the Delta that the supply chain serving American forces could not have provided. It arrived through the same Vietnamese civilian networks that the PBRs were supposed to be interdicting, which produced a specific operational irony that the men aboard those boats noted without particular surprise. By 1969 and 1970, as the American withdrawal began and the institutional clarity of the mission deteriorated in ways that mirrored the deterioration happening simultaneously across the American ground war, drug use in some river sections had moved from a disciplinary problem addressed in individual cases to an environmental condition that the petty officers managing boat crews managed around in the specific way that experienced petty officers manage problems the institution has not provided adequate tools to solve. This is not a generalization about PBR crews. The men who served on PBRs included some of the most capable small unit combat sailors the Navy produced in the Vietnam era, and the record of Game Warden and the Mobile Riverine Force documents their competence in the specific terms that operational records document competence: engagement outcomes, interdiction statistics, SEAL support missions executed, crossing operations disrupted. The drug use and the combat stress and the institutional deterioration of the late war period existed alongside that competence in the same men, in the same boats, on the same rivers. Both were real. The operational record emphasized one. The medical records documented the other. The men carried both. The SEAL teams that PBRs routinely inserted and extracted from riverbank positions throughout the Delta added a specific tactical dimension to river patrol that the Game Warden operational concept had anticipated, and that the execution of SEAL direct action operations produced in ways the concept had not fully specified. A PBR conducting a SEAL insertion was not on patrol in the Game Warden sense. It was a transport and fire support platform operating on a specific timeline toward a specific bank position that the enemy may or may not have been watching, inserting 4 to 8 men who would be on the ground for hours in the tree line while the PBR withdrew to a holding position and waited for the extraction call. The extraction was the tactical moment that PBR crews who supported SEAL operations described with consistent specificity in post-war accounts. A SEAL team calling for emergency extraction, the team in contact, unable to break away, needing the boats at the bank in the next 4 minutes, or the situation becoming unrecoverable, was a radio call that produced a specific physical response in the boat captain that no amount of training at Coronado had fully simulated. The boat went to full speed toward a bank position that a Viet Cong force was actively engaging in the dark, with the specific knowledge that the extraction had to happen at the bank, regardless of what the bank's tactical situation had become in the time since the insertion. You went to the bank because the men at the bank required it. The parallel to the Catalina rescue mission was not accidental. It was the same essential reality expressed through a different platform in a different war, which is that the man in a bad position requires the machine and the crew to come to him regardless of what the coming costs. What it cost in PBR SEAL support operations throughout the Delta was documented in the river section after-action reports that the Game Warden headquarters compiled, and that constitute the most granular operational record of small boat combat the Navy produced in Vietnam. Boats damaged during extractions, crew members wounded covering the bank while SEALs came aboard, boat captains making throttle decisions in the dark with a SEAL team half aboard, and a Viet Cong force 20 meters back in the tree line. The record is specific and detailed and written in the flat language of operational reporting that makes the specificity more present rather than less. The institutional changes that followed Game Warden's operational peak tell their own partial story about what the River War had revealed. The mobile riverine forces transition to Vietnamization. The progressive transfer of PBR operations to the Vietnamese Navy's River Patrol Force from 1969 onward was conducted on a timeline that the South Vietnamese Navy's training and organizational development had not fully prepared it for, which was consistent with the Vietnamization timeline across most of the American withdrawal. Vietnamese PBR crews were trained, equipped, and given operational responsibility for waterways that American crews had patrolled at a level of tactical competence built through years of operational experience. And the transfer of the boats did not transfer the experience with them in any quantity that the timeline permitted. The American crews who handed over their boats and their sectors and their accumulated knowledge of specific rivers to Vietnamese counterparts and came home did so in the context of a withdrawal that the country had decided upon and that the men executing it had not been consulted about, which was also consistent with the broader institutional experience of Vietnam service. They had been told the River War was decisive. They had run 250,000 patrol hours in support of that claim. The Viet Cong's logistical network through the Delta had been disrupted, degraded, and, in specific sectors at specific periods, genuinely interdicted. It had not been severed. The war had not been won on the rivers. Whether it could have been, or whether the doctrine that defined what winning on the rivers meant had ever been connected to a realistic theory of what the River War was supposed to achieve in strategic terms, was the question that the operational records raised without answering, and that the men who had run those patrols carried home without resolution. The homecoming for PBR sailors was the homecoming that Vietnam veterans across all services experienced in the specific years of the American withdrawal. The airports, the advice about the uniform, the silence where recognition was supposed to be. For the PBR crews, it carried the additional weight of a service that the public narrative of Vietnam had not made room for, in the way it had made room for the grunt in the jungle or the pilot over Hanoi. The River War had not produced the imagery that defined Vietnam for the American public. It had produced 250,000 patrol hours and 247 lost boats, and a casualty rate that the operational records documented, and that the national conversation about the war had not incorporated into whatever account it was constructing of what the war had cost and what it had meant. The men came home to that silence and processed it in the ways men process institutional silence. Some in veterans organizations that provided the specific community of shared experience that civilian life did not offer. Some in the work they found after the service, some not at all for years. And then in ways that the VA of the 1970s and 1980s was not equipped to address with any precision, and that the VA of the 1990s was only beginning to address with the vocabulary the experience required. One of those men was Boatswain's Mate Second Class Thomas Desmond Baird of Youngstown, Ohio. Baird was 22 years old when he reported to River Section 512 at Bin Tai in March 1968. 6 weeks after the Tet Offensive had demonstrated to everyone operating in the Delta that the war the operational briefings had been describing bore a limited relationship to the war the Delta was producing. He was assigned as boat captain of PBR 715, a Mark II, hull number corresponding to the second production batch delivered to Game Warden in late 1967, with the twin .50 forward mounts and the water jet system that the section's enginemen had already learned could pull a surprising volume of river vegetation through the intakes at full throttle in the canals south of the Bassac. He served 14 months in country, 2 months beyond the standard tour, the extension taken because his boat captain's billet had not been filled by the time his rotation date arrived, and because leaving the crew with no experienced hand at all was a calculation he could not make in the direction that left them without one. He ran approximately 340 patrols in those 14 months. He was wounded once, in August 1968, by a fragment from a B-40 that hit PBR 715's stern during an extraction of a seal element from a canal south of Can Tho, a fragment that entered his left thigh and was removed at the Bin Thuy Naval Facility without requiring evacuation. He was back on patrol 6 days later. He was at the forward gun mount on PBR 715 on the night of November 3, 1968, when the boat intercepted a Viet Cong logistics sampan convoy on the Bassac River's northern tributary near Phung Hiep. 7 sampans moving without lights, loaded with ammunition and mortar components bound for a VC unit operating in Chuang Thien Province. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. 4 of the 7 sampans were sunk. The cargo from the remaining 3 was recovered and documented in the Game Warden interdiction log as 340 kilograms of 82mm mortar ammunition, 160 kilograms of small arms ammunition, and 12 AK-47 rifles. The documentation noted the weight of the cargo with the clinical precision of an operational record that measured the river war in kilograms of interdicted ordnance, which was one accurate way to measure it. Baird came home in May 1969. He flew into San Francisco International, was advised by a Navy petty officer at the terminal that he might want to change before going through the main concourse, and changed in the airport bathroom. He took a bus to Oakland and a Greyhound to Youngstown. His parents met him at the station. His father, who had served on a destroyer escort in the Atlantic in 1944 and 1945, shook his hand and said it was good to have him back. His mother cried. Nobody else at the Youngstown bus station knew or asked. He worked for 32 years at a Youngstown steel fabrication plant, first on the floor, then in quality control, then as a shift supervisor overseeing the tolerancing process for structural steel components. He retired in 2001 when the plant closed in the consolidation that took most of Youngstown's remaining industrial base with it. He was active in the Vietnam Veterans of America chapter in Mahoning County from the late 1980s onward. Not at first, not for the first 15 years, but eventually when the chapter's membership had grown large enough that the meetings had the specific character of a room full of people who did not need the experience explained. He died in 2019 at the age of 73. His daughter, clearing his effects, found in the drawer of his workbench a navigation chart, a 1968 Defense Mapping Agency chart of the Bassac River and its tributaries south of Can Tho. The sector PBR 715 had patrolled through the dry season of 1968 and 1969. The chart was marked in pencil, patrol routes, waypoints, a handful of notations in handwriting she did not recognize, until she looked at other documents from the same period and confirmed it was his, younger, before arthritis had changed the way he held a pen. The canal south of Can Tho, where he had been wounded in August 1968, was marked with a small X, nothing written beside it, just the mark, and the river, and the distance between where he had been and where he had come from, measured in pencil on a chart he had carried home and kept for 50 years without ever explaining to anyone why.